Hello and welcome to Sleepy History. Settle in, get comfortable, and let your mind drift back with us. Tonight we're journeying to the Middle Ages to explore a rather dark yet fascinating aspect of their world, their intricate visions of hell and how they believed it truly operated. If you enjoy these quiet explorations, a gentle like or subscribe would be lovely. We're curious, where are you joining us from tonight? And what time is it in your corner of the world? Let us know. Now let's begin. Let the gentle cadence of history guide you toward rest. We turn our thoughts now to a time long past, a period often shrouded in a twilight of understanding, known as the Middle Ages. Imagine, if you will, a world lit not by the steady glow of electricity, but by the flickering dance of firelight, by the tallow candle, and by the diffuse light of the sun struggling through leaded glass, or simply an open window. The days were measured by the sun's journey across the sky, and the seasons dictated the rhythm of life in ways almost unimaginable to us now. Life, for many, was a tapestry woven with threads of hardship. It was a world where the line between survival and suffering was often perilously thin, a reality etched into the faces and the souls of those who lived it. Daily existence was, for the vast majority, an unceasing round of labor. From the first light of dawn until the encroaching darkness of dusk, work was the constant companion. Whether tilling the often unyielding soil, tending to livestock, or practicing a craft in a small, dim workshop, the body was rarely at ease. Comfort, as we understand it, was a distant luxury for most. The world beyond the village or the town was often a place of mystery and sometimes of perceived danger. Forests were deep and dark, roads were treacherous and poorly maintained, and travel was a slow, arduous undertaking, fraught with uncertainty. The known world was smaller, more intimate, yet also more isolating. Death was a familiar visitor, not a distant concept sanitized by modern medicine and institutions. It was present in the home, in the community. Childbirth was perilous for both mother and child. Diseases, for which there were few effective remedies, could sweep through a village or town with devastating speed, leaving grief and fear in their wake. Life was fragile, and its end often came swiftly and without warning. Famine, too, was a recurring specimen. A failed harvest, a prolonged drought, or an untimely flood could mean the difference between sustenance and starvation. The margin for error was slim, and the consequences of nature's whims or the disruptions of conflict were felt deeply and immediately by entire communities. Warfare, though often localized, was brutal. Raids, sieges, and skirmishes were not uncommon, bringing with them destruction, displacement, and the ever-present threat of violence. For the ordinary person, these events were terrifying disruptions to an already challenging existence, reminders of the instability that often lay just beneath the surface of daily life. In such a world of tangible hardships and intangible fears, the need for a framework of understanding, for meaning, was profound. And it was here, in the heart of medieval life, that faith and the church played an absolutely central, all-encompassing role. It was more than just a belief system, it was the very air they breathed. The church was not merely a building in the village square or the city center, it was the axis around which life revolved. Its teachings permeated every aspect of society, from the grand pronouncements of kings and popes down to the daily routines of the simplest peasant. It offered structure, guidance, and a lens through which to interpret the often bewildering world. The sound of church bells was a constant in medieval life. They rang out to call the faithful to prayer, to mark the hours of the day, to celebrate joyous occasions like weddings and baptisms, and to mourn the dead. These sounds were an auditory landscape, a reminder of the church's presence and its significance in the passage of time and the milestones of life. For the largely illiterate population, the church was the primary source of information and education, especially concerning matters of faith and morality. The stories of the Bible, the lives of the saints, the warnings of damnation, and the promises of salvation were conveyed through sermons, through art, the stained glass windows, the sculptures, the murals that adorned church walls. The local priest was often a pivotal figure in the community. He administered the sacraments, those sacred rites believed to be essential for spiritual well-being and salvation. From baptism shortly after birth, through communion, confession, marriage, and finally the last rites at the point of death, the church accompanied individuals at every significant juncture of their earthly journey. Faith provided solace in times of suffering, a sense of community in a scattered world, and a moral compass in a life filled with challenges. It offered explanations for the inexplicable, hope in the face of despair, and a promise that earthly struggles were not the final word. It taught that life on earth, with all its trials, was but a prelude to an eternal existence. This earthly life was seen as a pilgrimage, a test, and the stakes were incredibly high. The actions, thoughts, and choices made during one's brief sojourn in the temporal world were believed to have direct and everlasting consequences for the soul in the life to come. This wasn't an abstract theological concept, it was a deeply felt reality. The afterlife was not a vague notion, but a definite, structured reality with destinations clearly defined. There was heaven, the abode of eternal bliss and communion with God, reserved for the righteous and the pure. There was purgatory, a place of temporary suffering and purification for those souls who died in God's grace, but still needed to be cleansed of lesser sins before entering heaven. And then there was hell. Hell was the ultimate terrifying consequence, the destination for those who died in a state of mortal sin, unreconciled with God. It was the absolute antithesis of heaven, a place of eternal punishment, torment, and separation from all that was good and holy. The fear of hell was a powerful motivator, a shadow that loomed large in the medieval consciousness. Understanding the consequences of earthly actions was therefore of paramount importance. The Church taught extensively about sin, distinguishing between venial sins, which could be absolved through penance and contrition, and mortal sins, which, if unrepented, would lead directly to eternal damnation. This framework of sin and consequence was central to medieval moral thought. The concept of a final judgment was also deeply ingrained. It was believed that upon death, each soul would face a particular judgment by God, determining its immediate fate. Furthermore, there would be a last judgment at the end of time, when Christ would return to judge all of humanity, the living and the dead. This belief in judgment and eternal reward or punishment imbued everyday actions with profound spiritual significance. Life was a spiritual battlefield, where individuals struggled against temptation and sin, striving for virtue and righteousness, always aware of the eternal implications of their choices. The vivid imagery of the afterlife, particularly of hell, was not meant merely to frighten, though it certainly did that. It was also intended as a stark warning, a call to repentance, and an encouragement to live a life in accordance with God's laws. It served as a powerful tool for social control and for the reinforcement of moral codes. In a world where earthly justice could often seem arbitrary or absent, the idea of divine justice, where all wrongs would eventually be righted and all sins punished, offered a form of ultimate accountability. No one, not even the most powerful king or the wealthiest noble, was beyond this final reckoning. The intensity of this belief in hell, and the elaborate details with which it was imagined, can perhaps be better understood against the backdrop of the medieval world we have just sketched, a world of hardship, uncertainty, and ever-present mortality, a world where faith provided the primary lens for interpreting all of existence. Life was often brutal, and perhaps it made sense that the ultimate punishment would be conceived in terms of unimaginable, unending brutality. The struggles of this world, however intense, were finite. Hell, however, was eternal. This stark contrast underscored its terror. The medieval mind did not shy away from graphic depictions of suffering, whether in religious art, in morality plays, or in sermons. These were not meant for titillation, but as visceral reminders of what awaited the unrepentant sinner. The more terrifying the depiction, the more effective the warning. Therefore, when we delve into how people in the Middle Ages thought hell actually worked, we are not just exploring a curious theological or folkloric byway. We are touching upon something that was deeply woven into the fabric of their understanding of life, death, morality, and the very nature of the cosmos. It was a cornerstone of their worldview, a critical element in the spiritual drama that they believed governed not only their individual lives, but the destiny of all creation. The specifics of hell's torments, its geography, its inhabitants, these were subjects of intense speculation and vivid imagination. And so, as we prepare to explore these darker imaginings, remember the context. A world striving for divine order amidst earthly chaos. A people for whom the spiritual realm was as real, if not more real, than the physical world around them. Their concept of hell was a reflection of their deepest fears, their understanding of justice, and their profound need for a moral universe. Let us now gently close this chapter, setting the stage for our journey into the medieval understanding of what awaited souls in the fiery depths. Allow these thoughts to settle as we prepare to uncover the intricate and often terrifying details of how hell was believed to function in the medieval mind. The shadows of that age held many fears, and hell was perhaps the most profound of them all. The very realness of hell in their minds shaped their art, their literature, their laws, and their daily conduct. It was a fundamental part of the medieval psychological landscape, a constant, somber note in the symphony of their existence. Understanding this is key to understanding them. Having set our medieval stage, understanding the profound role of faith and the chilling reality of hell in the minds of those who lived then, we now gently turn our gaze to the origins of these powerful beliefs. How did such detailed and often terrifying visions of the afterlife, specifically of hell, come to be so deeply ingrained in the medieval consciousness? These were not notions that sprang from a vacuum, but rather evolved, layer by layer, from a confluence of sources, each adding its own distinct shade to the final, formidable image. The journey to understand the medieval hell begins, as so much of medieval thought does, with the sacred texts. The Christian Bible, while not offering a single, comprehensive blueprint of hell in the way it would later be imagined, provided foundational concepts and evocative imagery that sparked centuries of interpretation and elaboration. These were the seeds from which a vast forest of infernal lore would grow. In the Old Testament, the concept of an afterlife was somewhat nebulous, often referring to Sheol, a shadowy place of the dead, a kind of gloomy underworld for all, regardless of their earthly deeds. It was generally depicted as a place of silence and forgetting rather than active torment. However, later Jewish apocalyptic literature began to introduce ideas of judgment and differing fates after death, including fiery punishment for the wicked. It is in the New Testament that the imagery becomes more distinct and more aligned with later concepts of hell. Jesus himself used stark warnings speaking of Gehenna, a term derived from the Hebrew Gehinnom, the Valley of Hinnom. This valley south of Jerusalem had a dark history, once associated with pagan child sacrifice, and later used as a refuse dump where fires continually burned. Thus, Gehenna became a potent symbol for a place of fiery destruction and abhorrence. Christ's words often painted pictures of the outer darkness, a place where there would be weeping and gnashing of teeth. This phrase, repeated in the Gospels, powerfully conveyed extreme suffering, despair, and regret. It suggested an exile from light, from warmth, from the presence of God, into a realm of profound misery. Such phrases, while brief, resonated deeply and begged for further contemplation. Parables, too, offered glimpses into a differentiated afterlife. The story of Lazarus and the rich man, for example, depicted the uncharitable wealthy man in a place of torment, longing for a single drop of water to cool his tongue, separated by a great chasm from the blessedness of Lazarus in Abraham's bosom. This narrative provided a powerful moral lesson and a vivid, if limited, sketch of post-mortem suffering. The Book of Revelation, with its apocalyptic visions, contributed significantly to the imagery of final judgment and punishment. It speaks of a lake of fire and brimstone, where the beast, the false prophet, and ultimately death and Hades themselves are cast, along with those whose names are not found in the Book of Life. This image of a fiery lake became one of the most enduring and terrifying symbols of hell. These scriptural references, though potent, were often elusive and open to interpretation. They provided key motifs: fire, darkness, suffering, separation from God, but did not lay out a systematic geography or detailed catalog of torments. That task would fall to later thinkers, writers, and artists who built upon this sacred foundation. The early centuries of Christianity saw theologians, often referred to as the Church Fathers, grappling with these scriptural passages, seeking to understand their meaning and integrate them into a coherent doctrine. These scholars and writers play a crucial role in shaping the Church's official teachings and, by extension, popular understanding of hell. Figures like Tertullian, an early Christian author writing in the late 2nd and early 3rd centuries, were among the first to offer more graphic descriptions. He wrote with a certain fierce relish about the spectacles of the pagan world being consumed by fire on Judgment Day, painting a vivid picture of God's triumph and the suffering of the unrighteous. However, perhaps no church father had a more lasting impact on Western Christian thought regarding hell than Augustine of Hippo. Writing in the late 4th and early 5th centuries, Augustine's theological works became foundational for much of medieval doctrine. He argued forcefully for the eternal nature of hell's punishments, refuting ideas that such torments might be temporary or purifying. Augustine pondered the nature of hellfire, questioning whether it was a physical fire that could affect spiritual beings or a spiritual torment that manifested as fire. While he leaned towards a literal interpretation of fire, he also emphasized that the greatest pain of hell was the poiena damni, the pain of loss, the eternal separation from God, who is the source of all joy and goodness. Another highly influential figure was Pope Gregory the Great, who lived in the late 6th century. His Dialogues, a collection of stories about the lives and miracles of Italian saints, included numerous accounts of visions of the afterlife. These narratives, presented as factual, described specific torments for particular sins and provided tangible, relatable accounts of what souls might face after death. Gregory's writings were widely read and helped to popularize more concrete images of hell. These theological explorations and interpretations by the Church Fathers and later scholars began to flesh out the concept of hell, moving from evocative scriptural phrases to more developed doctrinal positions. They debated its nature, its duration, and its purpose, laying the intellectual groundwork for the more elaborate visions that would capture the medieval imagination. Yet, theological treatises, often written in Latin and debated among scholars, were not the primary means by which the intricate details of hell reached the common person. For that, a more accessible and vivid medium was required. This came in the form of popular visions, imaginative literature, dramatic sermons, and striking visual art. Among the most significant sources for the medieval popular imagination of hell were visionary texts, accounts of individuals who were believed to have been given a glimpse into the afterlife, including detailed tours of its infernal regions. These narratives, often dramatic and deeply personal, had a profound impact. One of the earliest and most influential of these was the Vision of St. Paul. Though not actually written by the Apostle Paul, this apocalyptic text, likely dating from the early centuries of Christianity but immensely popular throughout the Middle Ages, offered a guided tour of hell. In it, Paul is shown the various horrifying punishments meted out to sinners, with specific torments meticulously tailored to specific sins. Listeners and readers of the Vision of St. Paul would learn of rivers of fire, icy abysses, tormenting demons, and the precise agonies awaiting liars, blasphemers, the unchaste, the unmerciful, and many others. This categorization of sins and their corresponding punishments became a recurring feature in later depictions of hell, offering a grim and ordered catalog of divine retribution. Another immensely popular account was the Visio to Nugdali, or the Vision of Tundale. This 12th century text, originating in Ireland, recounted the journey of the soul of a knight named Tundale through heaven, purgatory, and a particularly gruesome hell. Its descriptions were extraordinarily vivid and often grotesque, featuring monstrous demons, terrifying landscapes, and invented torments. Tundale's hell was a place of extreme sensory overload, lakes of fire, frozen wastes, smithies where souls were forged and beaten, mountains of gluttonous sinners being devoured by a monstrous beast, narrow, perilous bridges over foul-smelling pits. The Vision of Tundale was translated into numerous languages and circulated widely, its graphic imagery leaving an indelible mark on the medieval understanding of hell. There were other influential visions as well, such as the account of the Vision of Drytelm, recorded by the Venerable Bede in his Ecclesiastical History of the English People. Drytelm, a Northumbrian man, was said to have died, visited the afterlife, and then returned to life to recount what he had seen, including a dreadful valley that was half raging fire and half bitter cold, where souls were tossed between extremes. These visionary narratives were so powerful because they transformed abstract theological concepts into concrete, relatable stories. They provided names, places, and specific details, making hell feel less like a distant possibility and more like a tangible, terrifying reality that one might actually experience. They offered a kind of infernal geography and a bestiary of demonic tormentors. The details from these visions were readily absorbed into the broader culture, feeding into sermons, manuscript illuminations, and even everyday conversation. They provided a shared vocabulary of fear, a common understanding of the horrors that awaited the unrepentant, reinforcing the Church's moral teachings in a visceral way. Sermons, delivered by priests and traveling preachers, were another critical channel for disseminating ideas about hell. In an age where literacy was rare, the spoken word held immense power. Preachers would draw upon scripture, the writings of the Church Fathers, and the vivid details from popular visions to paint terrifying pictures of damnation for their congregations. The aim of these sermons was often pastoral, to awaken sinners to the peril of their souls and urge them towards repentance and a virtuous life. Fear was a recognized and utilized tool in this endeavor. By describing the torments of hell in graphic detail, preachers sought to make the consequences of sin undeniably clear and immediate. Themes of fiery torment, eternal suffering, the gnawing of conscience, the hideousness of demons, and the despair of being utterly separated from God would have been common fare in medieval preaching. Repetition of these themes and images helped to solidify them in the minds of the listeners, ensuring that the warnings were not easily forgotten. These homilies often employed rhetorical devices designed to evoke strong emotional responses. They appealed to the senses, describing the stench of sulfur, the screams of the damned, the sight of grotesque demons, and the feel of unquenchable fire. The goal was to make hell as real and as frightening as possible. Beyond the spoken word and written visions, morality plays provided a dramatic and public enactment of the soul's journey in the dangers of hell. These allegorical dramas, performed in public spaces, often featured characters representing virtues and vices, angels and demons, and the ultimate fate of a protagonist like Everyman. A common and highly effective stage prop in these plays was the Hellmouth, a gaping, monstrous maw often depicted as the head of a fearsome beast, from which smoke, flames, and actors playing demons would emerge. This physical representation of the entrance to hell brought the abstract concept to life in a terrifyingly tangible way for audiences. Visual arts also played an indispensable role in shaping the medieval understanding of hell. In a largely illiterate society, images were a primary means of conveying religious narratives and theological concepts. Churches themselves became galleries of sacred art, designed to instruct and inspire the faithful. Doom paintings, vast murals typically located on the west wall of a church or above the chancel arch, the arch separating the nave from the sanctuary, were particularly potent. These depicted the Last Judgment, with Christ enthroned in glory, the souls of the dead rising from their graves, angels leading the blessed to heaven, and demons dragging the damned into a vividly portrayed hell. These paintings were often filled with graphic details of the torments awaiting sinners, bodies being boiled in cauldrons, stretched on racks, devoured by monsters or frozen in ice. Each sin might have its visual corollary in a specific punishment, reinforcing the lessons taught in sermons and visionary texts. The Hellmouth was a frequent motif here as well. Manuscript illuminations, the intricate illustrations in handwritten books, also provided a rich source of infernal imagery. Though accessible to a smaller, literate audience, these images often informed the work of other artists and preachers, and their motifs became part of the wider visual culture. Sculptures on cathedral facades and capitals also frequently depicted scenes of damnation and demonic figures. Thus, the medieval concept of hell was not a monolithic idea derived from a single source. It was a rich and terrifying tapestry woven from many threads. The evocative but sparse warnings of Scripture, the doctrinal elaborations of theologians, the incredibly popular and graphic accounts of visionary journeys, the dramatic exhortations of preachers, and the vivid, often gruesome depictions in art and drama. Each of these sources reinforced the others, creating a powerful and pervasive understanding of hell as a real, elaborately structured place of eternal and specific torments. It was this cumulative effect, this constant iteration of key themes and images across different media, that made the idea of hell so immediate and so profoundly influential in the medieval world. These weren't just abstract concepts, they were shared narratives, believed with a certainty that is hard for us to grasp today. The fire and ice, the demons and the darkness, the specific punishments for specific failings, all these elements coalesced from these diverse origins to form a truly formidable vision, one that shaped not only individual piety but also law, literature, art, and the very fabric of medieval society. It was a collectively constructed nightmare, born of faith, fear, and a profound need to understand the ultimate consequences of human actions in a divinely ordered cosmos. Having explored the wellsprings from which the medieval idea of hell arose, we now turn our minds to the place itself, or rather, how it was conceived as a place. For the people of the Middle Ages, hell was not merely an abstract concept of spiritual suffering. It possessed a tangible, albeit terrifying, geography. It was a realm with landscapes, features, and an internal structure, all imagined with a chilling vividness that served to underscore its dreadful reality. The most fundamental aspect of hell's perceived location was its direction, down. Deep beneath the surface of the earth, far removed from the light of the sun and the perceived sphere of God's immediate presence in heaven above, lay this domain of the damned. This downward orientation was rich with symbolism, signifying a fall from grace, a descent into spiritual darkness, and an ultimate separation from all that was good and holy. Scriptural passages often spoke of individuals descending into hell or the grave, sometimes using terms like Sheol or Hades, which were readily interpreted as subterranean realms. The cosmological understanding of the medieval period often placed the earth at the center of the universe, with the celestial spheres and heaven rising above, and a chthonic underworld region existing in its depths. Hell therefore had a logical, if terrifying, place in their model of existence. It was widely believed that certain physical locations on Earth could serve as actual entrances or conduits to this infernal underworld. Volcanoes, with their fiery eruptions, smoke, and sulfurous smells, were prime candidates. Mount Etna in Sicily and Mount Hekla in Iceland were particularly notorious in popular lore, sometimes referred to as gateways to hell, their rumblings and eruptions seen as glimpses of the fiery torments within. Even the ground near such places was often thought to be cursed or haunted, a place where the veil between worlds was perilously thin. These beliefs often wove themselves into local folklore, with specific caves or desolate marshes gaining reputations as hellmouths or places where demons were said to emerge. Shepherds might avoid certain valleys after dark, and travelers would whisper tales of eerie lights or unsettling sounds emanating from cracks in the earth, reinforcing the idea that hell was not just a theological concept, but a place with tangible connections to their own world. Caves, deep fissures in the earth, and even certain dark forests or turbulent bodies of water were also sometimes thought to be portals to the netherworld. Stories circulated of individuals who had supposedly ventured too close to such places and heard the cries of the damned, or smelled the brimstone that was so characteristic of hell's atmosphere. These tales further solidified the notion of hell as a physical, accessible, albeit perilous, place. The very air around these supposed entrances was often imagined to be tainted. Travelers might report unnatural cold, oppressive heat, foul stenches, or unsettling sounds in their vicinity, all taken as signs of the infernal energies seeping from the world below. This belief in physical gateways made hell feel less like a distant theological construct, and more like a looming, albeit hidden, neighbor. His downward placement also aligned with a moral geography. To fall into sin was to begin a spiritual descent that, if unarrested, could lead to the literal descent into hell. The weight of sin was believed to pull the soul downwards, away from the lightness and grace associated with heaven. Hell, therefore, was the ultimate destination for souls heavy with unrepented transgression. Beyond its general subterranean location, the internal landscape of hell was imagined with a remarkable degree of detail, drawing from scriptural hints, classical mythology, visionary literature, and popular imagination. It was conceived as a vast and varied domain, but unified in its purpose, to inflict eternal suffering in a multitude of forms. Darkness was a pervasive feature. If there was light, it was not the comforting light of the sun or the divine radiance of heaven. Instead, it was the lurid, flickering glow of immense fires, a light that illuminated horrors without offering solace, a light that cast long, terrifying shadows and revealed the instruments of torment. This was often termed dark fire or shadow light, a phenomenon that existed only to heighten the visibility of despair. For many, hell was the outer darkness spoken of in the Gospels, a place of profound and terrifying obscurity. Fire, of course, was perhaps the most dominant and widely recognized element of hell's landscape. Vast plains of fire, rivers of molten metal or burning pitch, and lakes of fire were staples of infernal geography. This infernal fire was often described as having peculiar properties, such as adhering to souls like pitch, burning with a black or sulfurous flame and inflicting pain not only through heat but also through its suffocating smoke and acrid fumes. This was the unquenchable fire, the eternal fire, prepared for the devil and his angels, a torment that consumed without destroying, ensuring perpetual agony for the damned souls trapped within it. But hell was not only a place of extreme heat. To emphasize the variety and intensity of suffering, it was often imagined to contain regions of unbearable cold as well. Inspired by visions like that of Drykelm, who saw souls tossed between fire and ice, medieval thinkers and artists depicted frozen wastes, icy winds that cut like razors, and lakes where sinners were encased in solid ice, their tears freezing on their faces. In these frigid zones, the torment was not of burning, but of a penetrating, bone-chilling cold that brought its own unique agony, causing flesh to crack and spirits to become brittle with despair. This juxtaposition of extremes made the torments seem even more inescapable. The sounds of hell were another assault on the senses. It was a place filled with the cacophony of suffering, the unending shrieks, wails, and groans of the tormented, the cruel, mocking laughter of demons, the clanking of chains, the hissing of serpents, and the roar of infernal fires. There was no peace, no silence, only the relentless noise of despair and punishment, a soundscape designed to shatter any semblance of composure or hope. The smells, too, were imagined to be overwhelming and repulsive. The air was thick with the stench of sulfur or brimstone, a smell associated with volcanic activity and thus easily linked to the subterranean fires of hell. Added to this were the odors of decay, putrefaction, burning flesh and other noxious fumes, creating an atmosphere that was both physically sickening and spiritually oppressive. Each breath was an intake of corruption. The landscape itself was utterly barren and hostile, a perversion of the natural world. There were no green fields, no life-giving waters, no beautiful vistas. Instead, hell offered desolate, rock-strewn plains, jagged, unclimbable mountains, and deep, lightless chasms. It was a place devoid of any natural beauty or comfort, designed to reflect the spiritual desolation of its inhabitants. Every stone seemed to radiate malice, every shadow to conceal a threat. Pits and abysses featured prominently, symbolizing the bottomless nature of despair and the inescapable depth of damnation. Souls could be imagined as falling endlessly, or being trapped at the bottom of dark, confining holes surrounded by unspeakable horrors. The idea of a bottomless pit from the Book of Revelation resonated strongly with this imagery, suggesting a finality from which no return was possible. Rivers were another common feature, though these were not the life-sustaining rivers of the earthly realm. Instead, they were rivers of fire, like Phlegethon from classical myth, which found its way into Christian conceptions, rivers of black, poisonous water, like the Styx, which also had to be crossed to enter the underworld, or rivers of filth and ordure, contributing to the overall squalor and horror of the place. Some rivers were described as being filled with ice shards or sharp rocks, their currents swift and merciless. Fetid swamps and bogs also appeared in many descriptions, places where sinners might be mired in muck and slime, tormented by vermin and serpents. These landscapes evoked feelings of stagnation, decay, and being trapped in a foul, inescapable environment. The very ground in hell was often depicted as treacherous and harmful, yielding no firm footing, only mire or burning sands. While much of hell was imagined as a wilderness of torment, there were also descriptions of infernal structures. Cities of despair, like the city of Dis in Dante's later, more formalized vision, but with earlier precedents, might be depicted with walls of red-hot iron and towers guarded by demons. These were anti-cities, places of horrific order and imprisonment rather than community and life. Their architecture was often described as a grotesque parody of sacred or noble buildings on earth, built not for glory or dwelling, but for confinement and the administration of pain. Within these infernal settlements, or scattered throughout the desolate landscapes, were specific locations of punishment, prisons, dungeons, torture chambers, and forges, where souls might be subjected to particular torments by demonic smiths. These imagined structures added a layer of grim organization to the suffering, implying a systematic and bureaucratic approach to eternal punishment. The very concept of a structured hell, with different regions or levels for different types of sinners, was taking shape long before Dante Alighieri penned his famous Inferno. While Dante provided the most iconic and detailed vision of a multi-layered hell, the underlying idea of graduated punishment and specialized torment zones was already present in the medieval imagination. This notion of stratification stemmed partly from a desire for a kind of divine, albeit terrifying, justice. It seemed fitting that not all sins were equal and therefore not all punishments should be identical. Greater sins or sins of a particular nature would logically be met with more severe or more fittingly symbolic torments in specific areas of hell. Early visionary texts, such as the Vision of St. Paul, depicted hell as having various distinct places of punishment. The seer would be guided through these regions, witnessing, for example, blasphemers hung by their tongues, or the unchaste immersed in fire and ice, each group suffering in a way that corresponded to their earthly transgressions. This provided a clear model for a differentiated hell. Similarly, the Visio Tinagdali described a series of horrific landscapes and encounters, each tailored to punish particular vices. Tundale might pass through a valley filled with monstrous smiths tormenting the proud, or cross a narrow, dangerous bridge over a pit where the avaricious were punished. These narrative journeys through hell implicitly mapped out its various departments of suffering. The landscape itself became an active agent of torment. This early sense of organization suggested that hell was not simply a chaotic pit of fire, but a complex, ordered realm, albeit one ordered towards maximum suffering. It mirrored, in a perverse way, the hierarchies of heaven and earth. Just as there were different choirs of angels and different stations in society, so too were there different degrees of damnation and specific places for each category of sinner. One might imagine a region dedicated to the punishment of pride, perhaps characterized by souls being crushed under immense weights or forced into humiliating postures, forever reminded of their earthly arrogance. Another area might be reserved for the envious, who could be depicted with their eyes sewn shut, unable to see the good fortune of others which they so resented in life, or perhaps forced to watch others' blessings from afar, consumed by their unending jealousy. Such specific symbolic punishments were common in visionary accounts. The gluttonous might find themselves in a foul, muddy swamp, forced to consume disgusting substances like toads and snakes, or tormented by an insatiable hunger and thirst that could never be quenched, surrounded by illusory feasts they could never reach. The wrathful might be eternally engaged in furious, pointless combat with each other, or dismembered by demons in a landscape of perpetual violence, their anger fueling their own torment. Lustful sinners were often depicted in fiery pits or icy wastes, or tormented by serpents and demons associated with their sin, their bodies subjected to agonizing defilement. Slothful individuals, who neglected their spiritual duties, might be condemned to ceaseless agonizing activity, or trapped in a state of profound lethargy and despair in a dark, stagnant place, unable to move or find respite. The 7 deadly sins often provided a framework for these imagined divisions of hell. Each sin could be assigned its own region and its own unique set of torments, creating a kind of moral map of the underworld. This categorization made the consequences of specific sins starkly clear to the medieval mind. Demons, too, were often imagined as specialized tormentors, each group perhaps assigned to a particular region of hell or to the punishment of a specific type of sin. Some might be tasked with stoking the fires, others with wielding instruments of torture, and still others with hurting and mocking the damned souls. This demonic hierarchy added another layer to hell's grim organization, a parody of celestial orders. The journey into hell, as depicted in many visions, was often a descent through these increasingly horrific regions. The deeper one went, the more severe the punishments became, and the further one was from any hope of reprieve or any connection to God. This physical descent mirrored a spiritual descent into utter hopelessness, and the landscape itself often seemed to conspire against the soul, becoming more treacherous and confusing with each downward step. The very nature of hell's geography could induce a profound sense of disorientation and loss of self. Labyrinths of dark tunnels, endlessly shifting landscapes, and the absence of any fixed points of reference would strip away a soul's sense of identity and purpose, reducing it to pure, suffering consciousness. So, while Dante's 9 circles would become the definitive literary map of hell for later generations, the medieval world before him already possessed a rich, if less systematically codified, understanding of hell as a vast, geographically diverse, and terrifyingly organized realm of eternal punishment. It was a place of pits and plains, fire and ice, all meticulously arranged for suffering. The ground itself in hell was often described as being treacherous. It might be strewn with sharp stones that cut the feet of the damned, or be a burning hot surface that offered no rest. Sometimes the very earth was said to be made of compacted sinners, their bodies forming the infernal landscape over which others were tormented, a truly horrifying image of communal damnation. Paths, if they existed, were perilous, narrow bridges over fiery chasms often no wider than a hair or a sword's edge, tightropes made of razors, or winding roads beset by demons. There was no easy passage in hell, only routes that led to further pain and despair. Every feature of the landscape was designed to contribute to the overall torment, actively hostile to the damned. Even the air, apart from its foul stench, was imagined to be harmful. It might be filled with flying darts of fire, fiery arrows shot by demons, or swarms of biting, stinging insects of monstrous size. In some visions, the air itself was a medium of punishment, either scorching hot or freezingly cold, or thick with a suffocating, choking smoke that burned the lungs. The architecture of hell, when depicted, was always oppressive and terrifying, a direct inversion of sacred spaces. Towers might be impossibly tall and teetering, symbolizing pride brought low. Prisons, windowless and cramped, reflecting spiritual confinement, and torture chambers filled with infernal machinery of diabolical ingenuity. These were not places of shelter, but extensions of the torment, designed to crush the spirit. Consider the sheer scale of this imagined realm. It had to be vast enough to contain all the damned souls from all of history and all those yet to come. Visionaries often described it as stretching endlessly, with new horrors revealing themselves around every dark corner or beyond every fiery mountain range. This immensity contributed to the sense of hopelessness, the feeling that one could wander forever and find no end to the suffering, no exit. The boundaries of hell were also a subject of thought. often great impassable rivers like Acheron or Styx, whose waters were said to cause forgetfulness or dread, or walls of fire or black unyielding iron were said to surround it, ensuring that no soul could ever escape. Gates, guarded by monstrous demons like Cerberus from classical myth, who was often incorporated into Christian hell, sometimes with multiple heads spewing fire or venom, further emphasized its nature as an inescapable prison. The medieval mind, therefore, did not simply think of hell as a bad place. They populated it with a detailed and terrifying geography, a landscape meticulously designed for every kind of suffering. This made the threat of damnation far more concrete and far more personal, as one could almost imagine the specific torments awaiting specific sins. One could almost imagine drawing a map based on these collective visions, a continent of despair with its burning deserts, its frozen tundras, its stinking swamps, its rivers of molten metal, and its cities of eternal night. Each feature would be labeled with the sins punished there and the torments inflicted, a grim atlas of perdition. This detailed geography served a crucial purpose. It made hell imaginable and therefore more frightening. By giving it physical characteristics, medieval preachers and writers could describe it in ways that their audiences could visualize, almost experience vicariously, thus heightening the impact of their warnings against sin. The very act of trying to map hell, of trying to understand its layout, was an attempt to comprehend the incomprehensible scale of divine justice and the terrifying consequences of sin. It was an exercise in facing the ultimate fear, a way of making the abstract threat of damnation concrete and immediate. The sky of hell, if it could be called that, was rarely depicted as open. More often it was an oppressive, smoky ceiling, heavy and low, or the roof of a vast echoing cavern, adding to the sense of claustrophobia and confinement. There were no stars, no moon, no comforting celestial bodies, only an endless, suffocating gloom or the harsh, unsteady glare of infernal fires. And amidst these landscapes, the souls of the damned existed in a state of perpetual sensory overload and deprivation. They were constantly assailed by horrific sights, sounds, and smells, yet deprived of anything beautiful, comforting, or life-affirming. Every natural pleasure was inverted into a source of pain. This was a key aspect of their torment. The geography of hell, then, was a geography of pain, a landscape designed by divine wrath and human fear, a place where every detail, from the smallest burning ember to the vastest frozen plain, contributed to the eternal suffering of those condemned to it. It was a truly awful, yet compellingly imagined world, reflecting the anxieties and moral certainties of an age. As we let these descriptions settle like layers of volcanic ash, remember that for those in the Middle Ages, this was not fantasy. This was a potential, terrifying reality, a carefully considered destination. The consistency of these geographical tropes across different texts and artistic depictions speaks to a widely shared and deeply felt understanding of what hell looked like and where it lay, deep within the earth and deep within their fears. Having journeyed through the imagined landscapes of the medieval hell, with its fiery plains and frozen wastes, we now turn our attention to those who were believed to populate this dreadful realm. For hell was not merely an empty stage of suffering, it was a domain teeming with malevolent entities, ruled by a supreme figure of darkness, and staffed by legions of tormentors. These inhabitants were central to how hell actually worked, for they were the active agents of its eternal agonizing purpose. At the apex of this infernal hierarchy, or perhaps more accurately, at its very nadir, in the deepest and most desolate part of hell, resided the ultimate source of its misery, Satan, or Lucifer. He was the fallen archangel, the prime rebel against divine authority, and the undisputed, though eternally tormented, ruler of this kingdom of shadows. His presence defined the very essence of hell as a place of ultimate separation from God. The names themselves, Lucifer and Satan, carried immense weight. Lucifer, meaning light-bearer or morning star, spoke of his former glory, his brilliance as one of God's most favored angels. This made his fall all the more profound, a descent from unparalleled light into the deepest darkness. His original splendor was often contrasted with his current monstrous form, emphasizing the corrupting nature of pride and rebellion. Satan, on the other hand, means the adversary or the accuser. This name highlighted his role as the constant enemy of God and humanity, the one who actively worked to oppose divine will, to tempt souls into sin and to accuse them before God. In the medieval mind, he was the ultimate source of all evil, the mastermind behind the world's suffering and corruption. The story of his fall was a cornerstone of Christian theology, and a frequent subject in medieval art and literature. Driven by insufferable pride, a refusal to serve, Lucifer was said to have instigated a great war in heaven, drawing a third of the angelic host into his rebellion. Defeated by the archangel Michael and the loyal angels, he and his followers were cast out of heaven, plunging into the abyss that would become their eternal prison and domain. Once in hell, Satan's physical form was imagined in truly grotesque terms, a stark antithesis to his former angelic beauty. He was often depicted as a colossal figure, sometimes so immense that his body itself formed a part of hell's landscape, or that hell was even conceived as existing within him. This gigantism emphasized his power and the scale of his evil. He was frequently portrayed as being immobile, perhaps frozen in a lake of ice at the very bottom of hell, as Dante Alighieri would later famously depict. This immobility symbolized his ultimate defeat and imprisonment, even as he reigned over the damned. He was both a king and a prisoner in his own realm, his suffering a core part of hell's torment. His features were monstrous and often symbolic. He might possess multiple faces, commonly 3, in a blasphemous parody of the Holy Trinity, each with its own horrific expression, perhaps one weeping, one roaring, and one gnawing on a sinner. Bat-like or leathery wings, a twisted mockery of angelic pinions, were another common attribute, signifying his fallen, demonic nature. Horns, claws, a bestial snout, and a hairy, often dark-hued body completed the image of a being utterly corrupted and debased. Sometimes he was shown with a gaping maw, consuming the souls of sinners, only to excrete them again in a horrific cycle of torment, emphasizing the futility and degradation of damnation. The very sight of him was a punishment in itself. In some traditions, Satan's body itself was a landscape of torment. Sinners might be trapped within his organs, or his very breath might be a scorching or freezing wind that swept through hell. This internalization of hell within its ruler underscored the idea that he was not just in hell, but that hell was an extension of his own corrupted being. Despite his apparent rulership, it was crucial to medieval theology that Satan was also a sufferer. His pride led to his fall, and his eternal state was one of undiminished, though perhaps differently experienced, torment. He was trapped in his own hatred and separation from God, a pain that no amount of power over the damned could alleviate. His primary role, beyond his own suffering, was that of the arch-deceiver. He was the tempter who had led humanity astray in the Garden of Eden, and his efforts to corrupt souls continued unabated. From his infernal throne, or frozen prison, he was still believed to direct his legions of demons, sending them forth into the world of the living to sow discord, tempt the righteous, and ensnare the unwary, thereby constantly seeking to swell the population of his grim kingdom. Yet paradoxically, in his tormenting of the damned, he also served as an unwitting instrument of God's justice, meting out the punishments that divine law decreed for unrepentant sinners. His kingdom of evil operated within the larger, permissive will of God, a dark stage upon which the consequences of free will were enacted. His power, though formidable in the earthly and infernal realms, was always understood to be finite and ultimately subordinate to the omnipotence of God. He could only act within the limits permitted by divine providence. This ensured that even in the darkest depictions of hell, there was an underlying sense of God's ultimate control over all creation, including the domain of evil. Satan was not alone in his infernal kingdom. Serving him, and sharing in his fallen state, were the countless legions of demons. These were the other angels who had joined Lucifer's rebellion, cast out of heaven alongside him, and now forming the vast, malevolent population of hell. Their primary occupation was the active torment of damned human souls. Their numbers were often described as almost infinite, like swarms of locusts or grains of sand, filling every dark corner of hell. This overwhelming multitude emphasized the pervasive nature of demonic influence and the sheer scale of the forces arrayed against good. Each damned soul might have multiple demons assigned to its specific torment. The appearance of these lesser demons was a subject of boundless and terrifying creativity in medieval art and writing. They were rarely depicted as uniform. Instead, variety and grotesque imagination were key. Their forms were often hideous amalgams of human and animal parts, designed to inspire terror and revulsion. Their bodies, though perhaps not physical in the human sense, were capable of interacting painfully with the souls or spiritual bodies of the damned, and they could shift or manifest in forms best calculated to inspire dread in their victims. One might see demons with the heads of wolves, goats, or monstrous birds attached to distorted human torsos. They frequently possessed sharp claws, reptilian scales, long, lashing tails, cloven hooves, or snouts that dripped venom or fire. Their bodies could be emaciated and skeletal or bloated and putrid, often colored in sickly shades of black, dark green, bruise-like purple, or fiery red. Some were thought to be able to alter their appearance, becoming seductive on earth, but revealing their true, horrifying forms in hell. Their faces were contorted into permanent expressions of malice, hatred, and cruel glee. Eyes might glow like hot coals, or be cold and reptilian. Mouths were filled with needle-sharp teeth or tusks, and their voices were imagined as hisses, guttural roars, mocking laughter, or terrifying shrieks that echoed through the desolate landscapes of hell. These sounds were not mere noise. They often carried taunts, accusations, or blasphemies that tormented the soul. Many demons were depicted wielding specific instruments of torture, further individualizing their horrific roles. One might carry a flesh hook, another a set of red-hot tongs, a whip made of serpents or bellows to stoke the infernal fires that consumed the damned. These tools were extensions of their malevolent will, crafted with diabolical ingenuity for maximum pain. The distortion of the human form was a common theme. Demons might have limbs in the wrong places, multiple heads, or bodies that seemed to be a chaotic jumble of disparate parts. This visual chaos reflected their spiritual corruption and their opposition to the divine order and beauty of God's creation. They were, in essence, anti-angels, their ugliness a mirror of their inner evil. While often appearing as a chaotic mob, medieval thought also attributed a kind of hierarchy to these demonic legions, a dark reflection of heavenly or earthly orders. There were said to be princes, dukes, and various officers of hell, each commanding lesser spirits and perhaps overseeing particular regions or types of torment. This infernal bureaucracy underscored the organized nature of evil. Some demons were even known by specific names, drawn from apocryphal texts, folklore, or grimoires, though for the general populace, it was their collective malevolence and function that mattered most. Names like Asmodeus, Belial, or Beelzebub might be known to scholars or those versed in demonology, representing powerful demonic entities with specific spheres of influence, often associated with particular sins like lust or pride. However, more commonly, demons were categorized by their function or the sins they provoked or punished. There might be demons specifically tasked with tempting individuals to pride, others to lust, and so on. In hell, these same demons might then be responsible for inflicting torments related to those particular sins, ensuring a grim poetic justice. Some demons were imagined as infernal record keepers, meticulously noting down every sin committed by a human during their lifetime, presenting this damning evidence at the moment of judgment, or using it to taunt the soul in hell. Their primary and unceasing function within hell was the torment of the damned. This was not a reluctant duty, but one they pursued with boundless energy and sadistic delight. This joy in causing pain was often attributed to their profound envy of humanity whom God had favored, and their own irreversible misery. Tormenting others was a perverse outlet for their eternal rage and despair. They sought to drag all creation down to their level of suffering. The activities of these demons were described in graphic detail. They would drag souls with hooks from one place of torment to another, hurl them into pits of fire or onto beds of sharp ice, flay them with whips, saw them asunder, boil them in cauldrons, or subject them to an endless variety of physical and psychological tortures. Their creativity in cruelty was boundless. They were also masters of mockery and deception, even in hell. They would taunt the damned with reminders of their past sins, their lost opportunities for repentance, and the eternal nature of their suffering. They might offer false hopes of escape only to snatch them away, adding mental anguish to physical pain. The whispers of demons could be as tormenting as their physical assaults, playing on a soul's deepest regrets and fears. Beyond hell, these same demons were believed to be active on earth, constantly seeking to tempt humans into sin, to whisper doubts and evil thoughts, and to lead souls away from the path of righteousness. They were the unseen enemies in the spiritual warfare that every Christian was thought to be engaged in, their influence subtle yet pervasive. The presence of demons was a constant reality in the medieval worldview. They could be blamed for misfortune, disease, and temptation. Exorcisms and prayers were employed to ward off their influence. Thus, their role as tormentors in hell was simply a continuation of their malicious work on earth, but without the constraints of hope or divine intervention for the damned. Their nature was understood to be irredeemably evil. Having made their choice in the initial rebellion, they were incapable of good, their wills permanently fixed on hatred and opposition to God. While they too were inhabitants of hell and thus subject to its inherent suffering as fallen beings, they seemed to channel their own misery into inflicting it upon others, finding a dark satisfaction in shared damnation. Their relationship with Satan was generally that of underlings carrying out the will of their dark master. He was the general and they were his soldiers, united in their hatred of God and their desire to inflict pain. However, some depictions also showed infighting and rivalry among demons, reflecting the inherent chaos of evil. Even in their unified malice, their nature was one of discord. The constant, restless activity of these demonic tormentors was a key feature of hell. It was not a static place of punishment, but a realm of unceasing, dynamic cruelty. Demons were always busy, always inventive in their tortures, ensuring that the suffering of the damned was never allowed to lessen or become routine. They were the tireless enforcers of hell's grim justice. The damned souls themselves, while the primary objects of all this infernal attention, were generally depicted in a more passive role within hell. They were the victims, the recipients of torment, not active agents in the same way as the demons or Satan. Their existence was one of endless suffering and regret. Their interactions with the demonic inhabitants were characterized by terror, pain, and futile pleas for mercy that would never be granted. They were acutely aware of the demonic presence, constantly surrounded by their tormentors, with no hope of escape or respite. Every sight, every sound, every sensation was filtered through this demonic lens. For the damned, there was no corner of hell, no moment in eternity that was free from the sight, sound, or touch of a demon. The awareness of their eternal fate, coupled with the immediate and unceasing attentions of these grotesque and malicious beings, constituted the core of their damnation. They were utterly powerless, completely at the mercy of creatures whose sole purpose was to inflict pain. This was not just physical torment, but profound psychological agony born of being perpetually subject to pure, intelligent, and utterly unsympathetic malice. Therefore, when considering the inhabitants of hell, it is this dynamic between the powerful, malevolent demons and their overlord Satan on one side and the helpless, tormented human souls on the other that truly defined how hell was believed to work. It was an active, populated, and terrifyingly purposeful place. The sheer variety of demonic forms ensured that they could embody any number of fears. Some might be brutish and overtly violent, others more subtle and insidious in their torments, perhaps specializing in psychological torture or the exploitation of a soul's particular weaknesses and past sins. This diversity meant that hell could offer a personalized form of terror for every sinner. Even the tools and environments used by demons were extensions of their malice. The fires were stoked by demonic bellows, the icy winds were perhaps their breath, and the very landscape seemed to contort itself to aid in their torturous endeavors. Hell was a system where every element, living or inert, conspired towards damnation, often wielded by these infernal denizens. The hierarchy of hell, with Satan at its peak and various ranks of demons below, also served to underscore the idea that evil was not just chaos, but a perverted form of order, a kingdom organized in opposition to heaven. This made it seem all the more formidable and all the more real, a structured society of pure evil. The medieval imagination, therefore, did not leave hell sparsely populated. It filled it with a veritable army of darkness, led by a figure of ultimate rebellion, all dedicated to the eternal misery of those who had fallen from grace. These inhabitants were not mere background figures, but the very engines of hell's suffering, each playing a role in the eternal, infernal drama. Their constant motion, their tireless cruelty, and their grotesque appearances all contributed to the overwhelming sense of horror that hell evoked. It was a place where one was never alone, but always in the company of one's worst nightmares, made real and given power, intelligence, and an unyielding desire to inflict pain. The details of these inhabitants, from the specific features of Satan to the myriad forms of his demonic underlings, were endlessly elaborated in art, literature, and sermons, ensuring that everyone had a vivid, if terrifying, picture of who they would encounter should they be condemned to hell. This was not an abstract evil, but a populated realm of specific tormentors. This population of pure malice was a critical component of why hell was so feared. It was not just a place of unpleasant conditions, but a society of tormentors, a civilization built on pain, ruled by the Archfiend himself. The thought of spending eternity in such company, subject to their whims and their unmitigated hatred, was a powerful deterrent against sin, and a somber contemplation for the medieval mind. Who went there? The damned souls. We have explored the chilling geography of the medieval hell and peered into the shadowed existence of its demonic inhabitants. Now we turn to a question that would have weighed heavily on the medieval mind. who, precisely, was believed to be destined for this realm of eternal suffering? The answer, as understood in those times, was unsettlingly broad. Casting a long shadow of fear over daily life, it was not merely the domain of infamous tyrants or notorious criminals. The path to hell was thought to be wide, and many were believed to tread it, often through failings perceived as common to human nature. The fundamental key to understanding who ended up in hell was the concept of sin, specifically mortal sin that remained unrepented at the time of death. While God's mercy was infinite, it was to be sought through the channels prescribed by the Church: confession, penance, and a sincere turning away from evil. To die with the stain of serious sin upon one's soul without having sought or received absolution was to face the terrifying prospect of eternal damnation. True repentance was understood to involve not just a fear of punishment, but genuine sorrow for offending God, contrition, a full confession of one's sins to a priest, if possible, the willingness to perform acts of penance, and a firm resolution to amend one's life. A deathbed conversion could be valid, but the ideal was a life lived in awareness of sin and regular recourse to God's mercy. The fear of a sudden, unprovided death without the chance for these final spiritual preparations was therefore immense. The Church, through its teachings, sermons, and visual arts, provided clear, if stark, guidelines on what constituted such soul-engranduring behavior. At the forefront of these were the 7 deadly sins, a categorization of vices that became deeply ingrained in the medieval consciousness. These were not obscure theological points, but fundamental failings that could manifest in everyday life, making the threat of hell a very personal and immediate concern for everyone. These sins were seen as deep-seated inclinations that, if indulged and not countered, could corrupt the soul entirely. First among these, often considered the root of all other sins, was pride, or superia. This was not merely self-esteem, but an excessive, arrogant love of one's own excellence, a refusal to acknowledge God's supreme authority or one's own limitations and dependence upon Him. Pride could manifest as vanity, an obsession with worldly status, ostentatious displays of wealth or learning, or a stubborn insistence on one's own opinions against the teachings of the Church. It was seen in the noble who despised commoners, the scholar puffed up with his own knowledge, or even the artisan who credited his skills solely to himself rather than as a gift from God. Disobedience to legitimate authority, whether secular rulers or ecclesiastical superiors, was often seen as stemming from pride, a rejection of God's ordained order. It was the sin that led to Lucifer's fall, and thus was seen as particularly perilous, a direct challenge to divine sovereignty. Next came envy, or invidia. This was more than simple jealousy. It was a deep-seated sorrow or resentment at the good fortune, talents, or virtues of others, often accompanied by a malicious desire to see them diminished or to rejoice in their misfortune. Envy could lead to gossip, backbiting, detraction, slander, and a refusal to rejoice in the happiness of one's neighbor. It was seen as a particularly insidious sin because it often festered in secret, poisoning relationships and communities from within. In its spiritual dimension, it represented a rejection of God's distribution of gifts and blessings, a questioning of divine fairness, and a sorrow that God should be glorified in another. Wrath, or ira, was another gateway to damnation. This encompassed more than fleeting anger. It referred to uncontrolled rage, sustained hatred, a thirst for vengeance, or a bitter resentment that festered in the heart, refusing reconciliation. In a society where honor was paramount and feuds could be long lessened and bloody, the temptation to wrath was ever present. Murder was its most extreme manifestation, but even a heart consumed by unforgiving anger, simmering grudges, or violent words, if unrepented, could lead a soul to the torments of hell, where such fiery passions found their eternal, agonizing expression. The refusal to forgive others was seen as a barrier to receiving God's forgiveness. Sloth, known in Latin as acedia or sometimes tristitia, was a sin perhaps less dramatic in its outward appearance but considered profoundly dangerous. It was not simple laziness in worldly affairs, though that could be a symptom, but a spiritual apathy, a weariness or boredom with religious duties, a lack of zeal for God, and a despairing reluctance to make the effort required for salvation. This could manifest as neglecting prayer, avoiding the sacraments, failing to perform acts of charity, or succumbing to a deep-seated sadness, a statistica that made spiritual joy impossible and caused one to despair of God's goodness or mercy. Acedia was a draining of spiritual energy, leaving the soul vulnerable and indifferent to its own eternal fate. It was a quiet killer of the spiritual life. Then there was greed, or avaritia, This was an inordinate love of earthly possessions and wealth, often leading to miserliness, hoarding, and the exploitation of others for material gain. Practices such as usury, lending money at exorbitant interest, often forbidden or restricted, especially to fellow Christians, dishonest dealings in trade, shortchanging customers, or an obsessive focus on accumulating riches at the expense of one's spiritual duties or charitable obligations, were all seen as symptoms of avarice. Certain professions, like those of moneylenders or tax collectors, were often viewed with suspicion, as their work provided ample temptation to greed. The rich man in the parable, tormented in hell for his indifference to Lazarus, served as a potent warning that wealth unshared was a spiritual liability. Gluttony, or gula, followed. While often associated with the overconsumption of food and drink, leading to drunkenness or debilitating excess, its understanding was broader in the medieval context. It could encompass an excessive desire for any earthly pleasure to the point where it distracted from spiritual concerns, or a fastidiousness and obsession with fine foods, expensive wines, and luxurious comforts that indicated an attachment to the world rather than to God. It represented a failure of moderation and self-control, prioritizing bodily appetites over the soul's needs, and could lead to a dulling of spiritual perception. Public drunkenness was also a scandal that could lead others into sin. Lastly, there was lust, or luxuria. This referred to impure thoughts, desires, and actions, particularly those outside the sacrament of marriage, as defined by the Church. Fornication, adultery, incest, and any sexual act deemed unnatural or contrary to Church teaching fell under this category. In a world that placed high value on chastity and the sanctity of marriage, primarily for procreation and mutual support, lust was seen as a powerful and insidious force that could easily lead souls astray, defiling both body and spirit and leading to social disorder. Its torments in hell were often imagined as particularly fiery and defiling, with sinners immersed in filth or tormented by demons in explicitly sexual ways. For each of these 7 deadly sins, it was understood that a single unthinking lapse was not necessarily a ticket to hell. The Church distinguished between venial sins, which were lesser offenses that weakened the soul but did not sever its connection to God, and mortal sins, which were grave offenses that destroyed sanctifying grace in the soul. To commit a mortal sin required that the act itself be serious, grave matter, that the sinner have full knowledge of its seriousness and give deliberate consent of the will. If one died in such a state without true contrition, confession, and absolution, hell was the inevitable consequence. This made the examination of conscience a vital spiritual practice. The pervasive nature of these temptations, the daily struggles with pride, the pangs of envy, the flashes of anger, the allure of comfort, the desire for more, the indulgence of appetite, the pull of illicit desire, meant that the threat of hell was not confined to some distant other. It was a clear and present danger for every individual, regardless of their station in life. This understanding fostered a deep reliance on the Church's sacraments for spiritual cleansing and guidance. The idea that one sin could lead to another, creating a habit of vice that hardened the heart, was also prevalent. Beyond these common sins that could ensnare any soul, there were categories of individuals who, by their very beliefs or status, were widely considered to be destined for hell, often with little hope of reprieve unless they underwent a profound conversion, according to Church teachings. Chief among these were heretics. A heretic was not simply someone who doubted or held an erroneous opinion privately, but a baptized Christian who obstinately and publicly denied or altered a doctrine that the Church declared to be divinely revealed truth after being corrected by Church authority. In an age where religious unity was seen as paramount for social and cosmic order, heresy was considered an exceptionally grave offense. It was seen as a spiritual treason, a deliberate corruption of God's word that endangered not only the heretic's soul, but also the souls of those they might lead astray. Heresy was like a disease that could infect the entire body of Christendom, and its purveyors were seen as agents of Satan. The specific doctrines deemed heretical varied throughout the Middle Ages, with movements like Catharism or Waldensianism, among others, being condemned for their views on the nature of God, the sacraments, or the Church's hierarchy. The specifics of their beliefs are less important for our gentle exploration than the medieval perception of the act of heresy itself. It was a defiant rejection of the authority of the Church, which was believed to be Christ's body on earth, and therefore a rejection of Christ himself. Unless a heretic publicly recanted their views and reconciled with the Church, their eternal damnation was generally assumed, and often their earthly lives were forfeit as well, through inquisitorial processes and secular punishment. The fate of non-Christians was another area of grave concern, and often grim pronouncements. The prevailing theological principle was extra ecclesiam nulla salus. Outside the church, there is no salvation. This stark declaration had profound implications for how medieval Christians viewed those of other faiths, or no faith at all. For pagans, those who worshipped ancient gods or nature spirits, the outlook was generally bleak. While some early church fathers had allowed for the possibility of salvation for virtuous pagans who lived according to natural law, before the coming of Christ, the virtuous pagans sometimes placed in limbo, by the High Middle Ages, a harder line often prevailed, especially if they had been exposed to Christian preaching and rejected it. Their continued adherence to what was seen as idolatry and demonic delusion was a clear path to hell. The situation for Jews and Muslims, who shared some scriptural heritage with Christians but differed on fundamental theological points, particularly the divinity of Christ and the nature of revelation, was complex but often resulted in a similar conclusion regarding their eternal fate from the perspective of many medieval Christians. While Jewish communities existed within Christian Europe, often in segregated and precarious conditions, and Muslims were known through trade, crusade, and intellectual exchange, they were generally seen as having willfully rejected the truth of Christianity. This perceived obstinacy, this refusal to accept Jesus as the Messiah and Son of God, was often considered a damning offense, placing them firmly outside the possibility of salvation. There were, of course, theological debates about invincible ignorance, the idea that someone might not be culpable for their unbelief if they had no genuine opportunity to hear and understand the Christian message. However, in popular understanding, and often in official rhetoric, the lines were drawn quite sharply. Those who did not accept Christ as taught by the Church were outside the ark of salvation, their own prophets or laws insufficient for eternal life. The fear was that their very presence could be a source of spiritual contamination or temptation for the faithful. A particularly poignant category concerned the unbaptized, especially infants. Baptism was considered essential for salvation, as it was believed to wash away original sin, the inherited guilt from Adam and Eve's transgression that tainted all humanity from birth. Without baptism, even an innocent newborn was thought to carry this stain, barring entry into the full glory of heaven, the direct vision of God. This led to immense anxiety for parents and a rush to baptize infants as soon as possible after birth, given the high rates of infant mortality. Midwives were sometimes even instructed on how to perform emergency baptisms if a priest was unavailable and the child's life was in danger. The thought of a child dying without this sacrament was a source of profound grief and spiritual anguish for families. The most common, though not universally accepted, theological solution for the fate of these infants was the concept of the limbo of infants, limbus infantium. This was imagined as a place on the edge of hell, or a separate, neutral realm, where unbaptized infants would spend eternity. They would not suffer the torments of hell proper, as they had committed no personal sin, but they would also be deprived of the beatific vision, the direct, joyful sight of God that constituted the bliss of heaven. They would experience a kind of natural happiness, a perfect human fulfillment, but forever separated from the ultimate supernatural fulfillment of seeing God face to face. For adults who had the opportunity for baptism, but consciously refused it, or for apostates who renounced their baptism, the judgment was far harsher. This was seen as a deliberate rejection of God's offered grace and the essential means of salvation, and thus a clear path to damnation, a conscious choice for darkness over light. The cumulative effect of these beliefs, the many ways one could fall through common sin, the stark consequences of heresy or unbelief, the critical necessity of baptism, was a pervasive and deeply rooted fear of hell. This was not an abstract theological notion for scholars alone, but a visceral reality that shaped the worldview of ordinary people. It influenced their art, which often depicted graphic scenes of the Last Judgment and the torments of the damned, with souls being weighed and sorted by angels and demons. It filled their literature with cautionary tales and allegories of the soul's perilous journey. This fear also profoundly underscored the indispensable role of the Church. If hell was a constant threat, the Church was the divinely appointed refuge, the sole vassal offering the means of salvation. The sacraments, especially baptism to cleanse original sin, confession to absolve sins committed thereafter, penance to make amends, and the Eucharist to provide spiritual nourishment, were seen as essential lifelines, anchors in a stormy spiritual sea. Participating in collective rituals, like processions or rogation days, was also a way the community sought to avert divine wrath and secure blessing. The concept of a good death became incredibly important. This meant dying in a state of grace, having confessed one's sins, received the last rites, viaticum, or final Eucharist, and anointing of the sick, and being at peace with God and the Church. Families would gather, prayers would be said, and every effort made to ensure the departing soul was properly prepared. The Ars Moriendi, or art of dying well, became a popular genre of literature, offering guidance on how to face death with faith and resist the final temptations of demons. Therefore, hell was not envisioned as a distant possibility reserved only for the most monstrous figures in society. The gates of damnation were believed to be wide, and the paths leading to them were many, and often deceptively familiar, paved with everyday temptations and spiritual negligence, from the subtle workings of pride in a devout heart to the open rejection of church doctrine, from the unbridled rage of a moment to a lifetime of quiet, spiritual neglect. The dangers were everywhere. The line between salvation and damnation could seem perilously thin. This constant awareness of potential damnation fostered a culture of religious observance, a striving for virtue, however imperfectly realized, and a profound respect for and dependence upon the Church's authority and its sacramental system. The fear of hell was a powerful motivator, shaping individual conduct and reinforcing the social and moral order of the medieval world. Every soul, it was believed, stood perpetually at a crossroads, with one path leading to eternal bliss and the other to the unending horrors they so vividly imagined, a choice with stakes no higher. The thought of who might be there and the realization that there but for the grace of God go I was a sobering and constant refrain in the medieval spiritual consciousness. We have now considered the grim geography of the medieval hell, its demonic inhabitants, and the souls believed to be condemned to its eternal shadows. Our journey now takes us deeper, into the very nature of the suffering itself, the specific punishments, the catalogue of torments that the medieval minds so vividly and fearfully imagined. These were not random cruelties, but often part of a perceived divine, if terrifying, justice, where the agony of hell was meticulously tailored to the sins of earthly life. The overriding characteristic was their unceasing, unending nature, an eternity spent in varied, yet equally unbearable, agonies. The most pervasive and universally recognized torment was, of course, that of fire. This was the eternal fire spoken of in Scripture, and it manifested in countless forms within the infernal landscape. Souls might be cast into vast lakes of roaring flame, their spiritual or reformed bodies experiencing the searing pain without the mercy of annihilation. Rivers of fire, carrying waves of molten pitch or sulfur, were imagined to crisscross the desolate plains of hell, and sinners might be forced to swim within their burning currents or be dragged through their depths by demons. The very light from these infernal fires was described not as illuminating or comforting, but as a harsh, glaring radiance that served only to reveal the full extent of the surrounding horrors and the despair on the faces of other damned souls, a light that itself felt like an accusation. Sometimes this fire took the form of a burning rain or fiery hail, pelting down upon the damned, offering no shelter and no escape. The very air in certain regions of hell was thought to be superheated, scorching the lungs with every agonizing breath. This was not the cleansing fire of purgatory, but a punitive fire, designed solely for suffering. It was often described as a dark fire, one that gave no true light, only heat and terror, or a fire that adhered to the soul like burning pitch, impossible to extinguish or escape. The smell accompanying these fiery torments was invariably that of brimstone, or sulfur, a choking, acrid odor that filled the senses and added to the suffocating atmosphere. The constant, imagined scent of burning flesh, even if souls were not truly consumed in a final sense, would have been part of this dreadful sensory assault. For sins like avarice, some visions described the greedy being forced to drink molten gold, the very substance of their earthly desire becoming the instrument of their eternal pain. Those guilty of intemperate speech or blasphemy might have their mouths filled with burning coals or forced to lap at burning pitch. However, medieval hell was not a realm of monotonous heat alone. To provide variety and perhaps a torment even more chilling to the imagination, especially in the colder climes of northern Europe, vast regions of hell were conceived as places of extreme, unyielding cold. This was a cold that was not merely uncomfortable, but actively agonizing, a cold that pierced to the very core of being. Sinners might be submerged in lakes of ice, their bodies frozen solid, yet their consciousness fully aware of their predicament. The utter stillness and silence of these frozen zones, broken only by the cracking of ice or the brittle shattering of a soul's form, induced a unique psychological despair, a feeling of eternal stagnation and abandonment in a lifeless, crystalline wasteland. In these icy wastes, fierce, razor-sharp winds were said to blow, cutting at the exposed souls, Or souls might be encased entirely in blocks of ice, unable to move, their tears freezing upon their faces, their limbs becoming brittle and breaking. This torment of intense cold offered a stark contrast to the fiery regions, suggesting that hell held a comprehensive array of suffering, catering to all forms of sensory pain. The gnashing of teeth, a phrase from the Gospels, was often interpreted literally as the chattering of teeth in unbearable cold, or the sound of souls grinding their teeth in a mixture of agony, rage, and despair. Beyond these environmental torments of fire and ice, a vast category of suffering involved direct physical violation and mutilation at the hands of demons. These infernal tormentors were depicted as tirelessly active, their primary purpose being the infliction of pain upon the damned. Souls could be imagined as being perpetually flayed, their skin stripped from their bodies by demonic torturers wielding sharp knives or hooks. Dismemberment was a common theme, with limbs being torn or hacked off, only to be agonizingly reformed so the torment could begin anew. The infernal tools used by demons were described with grim inventiveness. Beyond simple hooks and whips, there were spiked rollers to crush flesh, augers to drill into bone, and elaborate mechanisms designed to stretch, compress, or contort bodies in unimaginable ways, each movement calibrated for maximum suffering. Demons were often shown employing a dreadful array of infernal tools, a grotesque parody of earthly crafts. Hooks were used to drag souls or to hang them like meat. Whips, often tipped with barbs, made of living serpents or constructed from iron chains heated in hellfire, lashed at bare flesh. Saws were used to slowly cut souls in two, while pincers might be heated red-hot and used to tear at sensitive parts of the body. Infernal racks stretched limbs beyond endurance, and heavy wheels were used to break bodies, the proud perhaps being bound to such wheels in an eternal, humiliating rotation. Monstrous animals, often reptilian or insectoid in form, or grotesque hybrids unlike anything in the natural world, were also depicted as agents of torment, gnawing, stinging, or crushing souls under the direction of their demonic masters. The concept of souls being endlessly restored only to be subjected to further destruction was a key element of these physical torments. There was no oblivion, no end to the capacity to feel pain. The body, whether a spiritual body or a reformed physical one, was merely a vessel for unending agony. This eternal recurrence of torture amplified its horror immeasurably. Devouring was another common torment. Monstrous demons, or even Satan himself, were often depicted with gaping maws consuming damned souls, chewing them and then perhaps excreting them, only for the cycle to repeat. This imagery of being eaten alive, of being reduced mere sustenance for demonic entities, was profoundly degrading and terrifying. Smaller verminous creatures, like serpents, toads, or monstrous insects, were also imagined to gnaw eternally at the bodies of sinners, often targeting areas related to their earthly sins, such as the eyes of the lecherous or the bellies of gluttons. Specific mutilations were often poetically linked to the nature of the sin committed. For instance, the tongues of liars, blasphemers, or those who engaged in slanderous gossip might be pierced with hot irons, stretched out and nailed down, torn out by pincers, or perpetually bitten by venomous snakes. The hands of thieves might be chopped off repeatedly or forced to grasp burning objects or serpents. The eyes of the envious, who looked with malice upon the good fortune of others, might be gouged out or sewn shut, condemning them to a literal darkness that mirrored their spiritual blindness. Then there were the torments of deprivation and foulness, designed to assault the senses and degrade the spirit through utter squalor. Forced consumption of disgusting substances was a frequently described punishment. Sinners, particularly those guilty of gluttony or uttering foul words, might be compelled to eat filth, excrement, vomit, toads, spiders, or to drink putrid blood, boiling pitch, or other noxious liquids. The torment of unslakable thirst was particularly acute in fiery regions, where souls might crave a single drop of water with an intensity that itself became an agony, while demons offered them only molten metal or burning liquids. Immersion in foul environments was another aspect of this. Instead of lakes of fire or ice, some sinners found themselves in fetid swamps, cesspools filled with human waste, or stagnant rivers of ordure. The stench in these regions was imagined to be overpowering, a constant reminder of corruption and decay. This was often the fate imagined for the lustful, their physical desires perverted into an eternity of repulsive contact and suffocating filth. In some visionary accounts, certain areas of hell were devoid of all sensory input save one, perhaps total darkness, combined with an overwhelming, unidentifiable stench or a crushing silence that magnified the internal screams of conscience. Darkness, often described as a thick, palpable gloom that could be felt, was a torment in itself, especially when contrasted with the remembered light of the world or the imagined radiance of heaven. This darkness was not peaceful, but filled with unseen terrors and the sounds of suffering. It was a confinement that bred despair and heightened every other fear. The absence of light was symbolic of the absence of God, the ultimate source of all light and goodness. Internal hunger and thirst were also potent torments. Sinners might be surrounded by illusory feasts, an array of delicious foods and drinks that would always remain just out of reach, or turn to ash, dust, or disgusting vermin the moment they were touched. This endless craving, forever unsatisfied, was a particularly cruel form of torture, especially for those who had indulged excessively in earthly pleasures. The absence of any true comfort, any clean water, any pure air, any form of beauty was a constant state in hell, a perpetual Lent without the hope of Easter. Psychological and sensory overload formed another broad category of infernal suffering. The biblical phrase weeping and gnashing of teeth was a constant refrain, signifying not just physical pain but profound despair, bitter regret, and helpless rage against one's eternal condition. Souls were acutely aware of what they had lost, the chance for salvation, the joys of heaven, the presence of God, and this awareness, often sharpened by a perfect tormenting memory of every squandered grace and unrepented sin, was a ceaseless torture to their conscience. The memory of earthly joys, now irrevocably lost, would serve only to deepen the present agony. The noise of hell was imagined to be relentless and unbearable. There were the constant screams, wails, and groans of countless other damned souls, a symphony of agony that never ceased. Added to this was the mocking laughter of demons, their taunts, their blasphemies, and the cacophonous sounds of their infernal activities, the clanking of chains, the roar of fires, the grating of infernal machinery. There was no silence, no peace, no moment of quiet reflection, only an overwhelming auditory assault designed to shatter the mind. The sights of hell were equally tormenting. Beyond the horrific landscapes and the grotesque forms of demons, souls were forced to witness the sufferings of others. This was not a source of solace or shared community, but rather an amplification of their own misery, as they saw their own fate reflected in the agonies around them. Sometimes, former companions in sin would be bound together, their presence a mutual torment as they accused and blamed one another for their shared damnation, their earthly affections twisted into eternal hatred and recrimination. Feelings of claustrophobia were induced by descriptions of sinners being crushed under immense weights, perhaps representing the weight of their sins, or confined in impossibly tight spaces, within narrow pits, buried alive in burning sand, or even squeezed within the bodies of demons. This sense of being trapped, with no possibility of escape, was a core psychological torment. Endless, repetitive, and pointless labor was another form of punishment, echoing classical myths like that of Sisyphus. Sinners might be forced to perform exhausting tasks that never achieved any purpose, such as carrying heavy burdens up steep hills only to have them rolled down again, or trying to fill leaking vessels with water, or endlessly spinning wheels that ground nothing. This emphasized the futility and meaninglessness of existence in hell. The overwhelming and ever-present sense of hopelessness was perhaps the ultimate psychological torment. The knowledge that this suffering was eternal, that there would be no reprieve, no end, no possibility of change or redemption, would crush any spirit. This despair was the true second death, a spiritual annihilation of hope, the understanding that their state was fixed and unalterable for all time. Many of these diverse torments were linked by the principle of poetic justice, or contrapasso, where the punishment directly mirrored or was an ironic inversion of the earthly sin. This meticulous correspondence was a hallmark of medieval visions of hell, lending a grim logic to its horrors. The proud, who sought to elevate themselves in life, might be broken on a wheel, forced to crawl through filth, or crushed under heavy stones in hell, experiencing profound humiliation. Their quest for worldly glory inverted into eternal shame. The avaricious, who loved earthly riches, might be forced to swallow molten gold or silver, or be burdened with heavy bags of money that they had to carry eternally, their necks bowed under the weight of their useless treasure. Those who had been cold and uncharitable in life might find themselves frozen in ice, their hearts as cold in hell as they were to the needy on earth. The lustful, who sought illicit bodily pleasure, might be tormented by fires that inflamed their passions to an agonizing degree, or by demons that represented their perverse desires, or immersed in filth and stench, their sensory indulgence turned to revulsion. The envious, as mentioned, might have their eyes sewn shut, unable to look upon anything, just as they looked upon others' good with malice. Gluttons might be tormented by extreme hunger and thirst, while surrounded by inedible or repulsive substances, their overindulgence replaced by agonizing lack. Those who indulged in wrath might be condemned to fight and tear each other apart endlessly in a pit, their anger becoming their eternal environment. Slothful souls who neglected their spiritual duties and wallowed in apathy might be forced into ceaseless, painful activity, hounded by demons or stung by insects into a state of constant, unwilling agitation. Slanderers and spreaders of discord whose words poisoned relationships on earth might have their tongues torn out, or be forced to endure demons whispering their own lies and calumnies back at them for eternity, mixed with the accusations of those they harmed. The medieval imagination was fertile in devising these correspondences, ensuring that each sinner could see the justice, however terrible, in their specific torment. This intricate system of punishment, where each sin found its specific and fitting eternal consequence, served to underscore the perceived justice of God, however severe. It was a way of illustrating that actions had direct and eternal consequences, and that the order of the universe, even in its darkest corners, reflected a divine plan. The Catalogue of Torments was thus not just a random collection of horrors, but a carefully constructed moral lesson written in the language of eternal pain. It was a vision designed to inspire fear, yes, but also a profound sense of accountability before an all-seeing, all-knowing God, where no sin went unnoticed and no spiritual debt unpaid. The sheer, exhaustive detail of these imagined sufferings ensured they lingered in the mind, a constant, chilling reminder of what was believed to lie beyond the grave for the unrepentant. Having delved into the medieval understanding of hell, its terrifying geography, its demonic inhabitants, and the catalogue of torments awaiting damned souls, it becomes clear that such potent beliefs could not remain confined to theological treatises or whispered tales. They were bound to seep into the very fabric of society, shaping how people saw their world, their actions, and their ultimate destiny. This chapter will gently explore how these vivid conceptions of eternal punishment manifested in medieval culture, art, and the daily lives of those who lived under their pervasive shadow. The medieval world was one where the spiritual and the temporal were deeply intertwined. The veil between this life and the next was perceived as thin, and the consequences of earthly actions for the immortal soul were a matter of constant, serious consideration. The detailed and horrifying visions of hell we have discussed were not mere intellectual exercises. They were urgent warnings, powerful narratives that resonated through every level of society. For a population that was largely illiterate, visual and oral means of communication were paramount. The Church, as the primary guardian and interpreter of spiritual truths, understood the power of imagery to instruct, to admonish, and indeed, to terrify the faithful into adherence with its teachings. Churches themselves became vast canvases, stone and glass storybooks depicting the drama of salvation and damnation. Perhaps the most striking and ubiquitous examples of this were the doom paintings, vast frescoes or murals that often adorned the west wall of a church, the wall parishioners faced as they exited, or the chancel arch above the altar, a constant reminder during the most sacred rites. These paintings typically depicted the Last Judgment with dramatic intensity. Christ would be shown enthroned as judge, often displaying his wounds with angels and saints beside him. Beyond the general scenes, artists developed specific visual shorthand. Demons were almost universally depicted as dark, often hairy, with grotesque animalistic features like horns, claws, and tails, their bodies contorted and unnatural. Sinners were often shown naked and vulnerable, their social status stripped away, emphasizing equality and damnation. Below, the dead would be seen rising from their graves, some guided by angels towards the joys of heaven, usually depicted on Christ's right side. On his left, however, a far more grim procession unfolded. Demons, rendered with grotesque creativity, would be shown dragging, hooking, and herding struggling human figures towards the gaping, monstrous hellmouth, often portrayed as the fiery maw of a terrifying beast. Within these depictions of hell, artists would frequently include specific torments for various sins, drawing directly from the popular visionary literature we have explored. The proud might be shown broken on a wheel, the avaricious with bags of money around their necks or forced to swallow molten gold, the lustful boiled in cauldrons or tormented by serpents. These visual catalogues of suffering served as an immediate and unforgettable lesson for all who gazed upon them. The Archangel Michael was often a central figure, depicted weighing souls in a great balance, with a small, cowering demon attempting to tip the scales in hell's favor. Stained glass windows, particularly in the grander cathedrals and churches, also played a crucial role in this visual pedagogy. As light streamed through the richly colored glass, scenes from scripture, the lives of saints, and warnings of judgment would come alive with an almost ethereal glow. Depictions of devils, torment, and the fall of the damned, though perhaps less overwhelmingly vast than doom paintings, were nonetheless powerful components of this luminous narrative, instructing the congregation through beauty and fear combined. The very colors could be symbolic, with fiery reds and oranges dominating scenes of hell, contrasted with the celestial blues and golds of heaven. Illuminated manuscripts, though accessible primarily to the literate elite, clergy, nobility, and wealthy merchants, also contained extraordinarily vivid and often gruesome depictions of hell. Psalters, books of hours, personal prayer books, and manuscripts of apocalyptic texts like the Book of Revelation were frequently adorned with intricate miniatures showing demons, the tortures of the damned, and the architecture of the infernal regions. These images, contemplated in private moments of devotion or study, reinforced the theological teachings and fueled the broader artistic imagination concerning hell. The creativity found in these illuminations, the sheer variety of demonic forms and infernal landscapes, was boundless. Sculpture, too, brought these fearsome concepts into three-dimensional reality. The tympanums above the main portals of Romanesque and Gothic cathedrals often featured grand sculptural programs of the Last Judgment, serving as a solemn welcome and warning to all who entered. Christ in majesty, the weighing of souls, the separation of the blessed and the damned, and graphic scenes of demons gleefully tormenting sinners were common themes, carved in stone for all eternity. Even smaller sculptural elements such as capitals atop columns, carvings on choir stalls, or the often hidden and whimsical, yet sometimes terrifying, misericords, small wooden seats on the underside of hinged choir stall seats, could feature demonic figures, monstrous beasts, or allegories of sin and its consequences. Hell was quite literally built into the fabric of these sacred spaces, an inescapable reminder of what lay in store for the unrighteous. The hellmouth motif, that gaping beastly entrance to the underworld, became an iconic image, appearing across all forms of medieval art, from monumental paintings and sculptures to small manuscript illuminations and stage props. This terrifying familiarity made hell seem like a tangible place one could actually enter, often depicted with flames, teeth, and desperate souls visible within its gullet. Beyond the static visual arts, morality plays and public religious performances brought the drama of salvation and damnation to life in a very immediate and emotional way. These plays, often performed in public squares or on church steps, featured allegorical characters such as everyman, good deeds, knowledge, and personifications of the seven deadly sins. Demons, played by actors in grotesque costumes, would actively tempt the protagonist and dramatically drag unrepentant sinners off stage towards a hellmouth prop, often accompanied by firecrackers, smoke, and terrifying noises. The impact on audiences, witnessing these struggles and consequences enacted before their very eyes, must have been profound. Vernacular literature, too, from epic poems like Dante's Inferno, though late medieval, its roots are here, to popular sermons and even cautionary tales embedded in romances or fables, constantly reiterated these themes, ensuring that the concepts of sin, judgment, and hell were familiar to all, regardless of their ability to read theological texts. This pervasive cultural immersion in the imagery and narratives of hell inevitably shaped daily behavior and spiritual practices. The ever-present fear of sudden death was a significant factor. In an age of plague, famine, and frequent warfare, life was precarious, and the thought of dying unexpectedly in a state of unrepented mortal sin was a source of profound anxiety. This spurred a desire to remain in a state of grace as much as possible. Beyond the formal sacraments, individuals engaged in various personal devotional practices to seek protection and foster a sense of spiritual security. This included the recitation of specific prayers, like the Pater Noster and Ave Maria, the veneration of relics of saints, wearing scapulars or religious medals, and making personal vows or undertaking pilgrimages to holy shrines in penance or petition. The sacrament of confession or penance, therefore, assumed enormous importance in medieval religious life. It was the primary means by which individuals could receive forgiveness for sins committed after baptism, and thus hope to avoid eternal damnation. The process typically involved sincere contrition, sorrow for sin, an honest and complete confession of one's sins to a priest, the priest's pronouncement of absolution, and the performance of an assigned penance, prayers, fasting, almsgiving, or even pilgrimages, to make satisfaction for the harm caused by sin. Regular confession was encouraged, and for many it provided a source of psychological relief, a way to unburden the conscience and restore one's relationship with God. However, it could also be a source of anxiety, with scrupulous individuals worrying if their confession had been complete enough or their contrition sincere enough to truly secure forgiveness. The priest, as the minister of this sacrament, held a position of considerable spiritual authority. Sermons delivered from the pulpit constantly reinforced these themes. Preachers would vividly describe the joys of heaven, the pains of hell, and the necessity of living a virtuous Christian life. They would exhort their congregations to avoid sin, to practice charity, to attend Mass regularly, and to prepare for a holy death. The fear of hell was a powerful rhetorical tool used to encourage moral rectitude and adherence to church teachings. This fear acted as a form of social control, reinforcing community norms and discouraging behavior deemed sinful or disruptive. Living a good Christian life involved much more than just avoiding obvious wrongdoing. It encompassed a range of positive practices: regular prayer, both private and communal, fasting during prescribed times like Lent, giving alms to the poor and supporting the church, attending Mass, especially on Sundays and holy days, and showing reverence for sacred relics and saints. All these actions were seen as part of the path to salvation, ways of accumulating spiritual merit. The legal systems of the time, while dealing with earthly crimes, also operated within this overarching framework of divine justice. While secular punishments were for breaches of human law, there was often an underlying sense that truly heinous crimes were also grave sins that imperiled the soul. The Church itself had its own courts and systems of justice for spiritual offenses. The belief in an ultimate, inescapable divine judgment where all secrets would be revealed and all deeds weighed provided a powerful, if unseen, backdrop to all forms of earthly justice. In this landscape of stark spiritual choices, the concept of purgatory offered a merciful, though still daunting, alternative for many. Purgatory, as understood in the medieval period, was not a lesser hell, nor a second chance for those condemned to hell. Rather, it was a place or state of temporary purification for souls who died in God's grace, meaning they were not in a state of unrepented mortal sin, but still bore the stain of lesser venial sins, or had not fully completed the temporal punishment due for mortal sins that had already been forgiven in confession. The suffering in purgatory was often described using imagery similar to that of hell, particularly fire. Souls in purgatory endured painful cleansing, a purging of their remaining imperfections. However, there were two crucial differences that set purgatory entirely apart from hell. Firstly, the suffering in purgatory was finite. It had an end. Secondly, souls in purgatory were assured of eventually entering heaven. Their pain was therefore imbued with hope, a painful journey towards ultimate bliss rather than the hopeless eternal agony of hell. This belief in purgatory provided a more attainable spiritual goal for the average Christian, who might struggle with sin but sincerely sought to live a faithful life. It acknowledged human imperfection while still upholding the necessity of divine justice and purity for entry into heaven. The fear of hell remained the ultimate deterrent, but the prospect of purgatory and the possibility of shortening one's time there became a significant focus of religious practice. This focus also manifested in communal efforts. Confraternities and guilds often had provisions for prayers and masses to be said for deceased members, ensuring mutual spiritual support that extended beyond the grave. Wealthier individuals endowed chantries, chapels where priests were paid to offer masses specifically for the repose of their souls and those of their family, hoping to expedite their journey through purgatory. Medieval Christians believed that the prayers and good works of the living could assist souls in purgatory, hastening their purification and entry into heaven. This led to the widespread practice of offering masses for the dead, giving alms in their name, lighting candles, and undertaking pious acts on their behalf. The doctrine of indulgences also became prominent, representing a remission of the temporal punishment due for sins, granted by the Church under certain conditions which could be applied to oneself or to souls in purgatory. The business of salvation, including donations for church building, bequests in wills for masses, and the purchase of indulgences, was significantly fueled by this deep concern for the afterlife, reflecting a society where spiritual well-being was a paramount investment. The intercession of saints was also fervently sought. Saints already in heaven were believed to be powerful advocates before God, and their prayers could be solicited to aid both the living in their spiritual struggles and the souls undergoing purification in purgatory. This entire complex of belief and practices surrounding purgatory, while distinct from hell, was nonetheless deeply connected to the overarching concern for the afterlife and the desire to avoid eternal loss. Thus, the medieval world was indeed steeped in the fear and imagery of hell. It was a fear that echoed in the grandest cathedrals and the humblest parish churches, in the writings of theologians and the songs of minstrels, In the private prayers of individuals and the public rituals of communities, this constant awareness of judgment and potential damnation must have induced a complex psychological state, a blend of profound anxiety, a desperate hope for mercy, and an acute vigilance over one's thoughts and actions. Life was perceived as a constant spiritual drama where every choice had eternal significance. This fear was a powerful shaping force, influencing art, literature, daily behavior, and the very way people understood their place in the cosmos. Life was a pilgrimage, fraught with spiritual dangers, with the terrifying abyss of hell on one side and the glorious hope of heaven, often via the purifying fires of purgatory, on the other. The Church stood as the guide and guardian, offering the map and the means to navigate this perilous journey, a journey whose ultimate destination was of the utmost importance to every medieval soul. As we have journeyed through the medieval understanding of hell, painting a picture of its fiery landscapes, its demonic denizens, and its dreadful torments, it is important to pause and acknowledge a gentle nuance. While the core concepts we have explored were indeed powerful and pervasive across medieval Christendom, the term Middle Ages itself spans roughly 1,000 years of history and encompasses a vast tapestry of cultures and regions, from the Mediterranean to Scandinavia, from Ireland to the Byzantine frontiers. It is natural, therefore, that beliefs about hell, while sharing a terrifying common ground, were not entirely monolithic or static throughout this long and diverse period. Think of it not as one single, unchanging blueprint of damnation, but rather as a central, deeply etched theme upon which different artists, thinkers, and cultures might add their own particular brushstrokes, their own regional colors, or their own evolving interpretations over the centuries. The fundamental dread and the core tenets remained, but the specific details of hell's depiction and the emphasis placed on certain aspects could indeed vary, reflecting the rich and complex tapestry of medieval life and thought itself. For instance, over the vast span of the Middle Ages, there were subtle chronological shifts in how it was conceptualized. Early medieval depictions, closer in time to the fall of the Roman Empire and the Dark Ages, might have sometimes leaned towards a more chaotic, elemental vision of the underworld, perhaps drawing on starker scriptural interpretations or even echoes of pre-Christian Germanic or Celtic underworlds. As the centuries progressed, particularly into the High and Late Middle Ages, with the rise of scholastic theology and the flourishing of visionary literature, descriptions of hell often became more systematized, more elaborately detailed, and more psychologically complex. The infernal bureaucracy and its precise torments became subjects of more intricate speculation. Regional differences also played a part in coloring the common perception of hell. While the torment of fire was almost universally central, as it is so vividly described in Scripture, the emphasis on other elements could fluctuate. In the colder climes of Northern Europe, for example, visions and artistic depictions of hell frequently gave great prominence to landscapes of eternal ice and biting frozen winds. Narratives like the Irish vision of Tundale or Bede's account of Dreikelm's vision, with their stark contrasts of fire and ice, resonated deeply in these regions, where the experience of extreme cold was a familiar and potent fear. This is not to say that Mediterranean conceptions excluded cold, but the imaginative emphasis could subtly differ. Furthermore, local folklore and lingering pre-Christian beliefs could sometimes subtly interweave with Christian teachings about the afterlife. The forms and names of minor demons or the specific nature of certain shadowy realms on the periphery of hell might occasionally betray these older influences, creating unique local flavors in the popular understanding of the infernal world. These were often assimilated and Christianized, but the echoes could remain, adding another layer to the complex image of hell. A distinction also existed then as now between the more nuanced discussions of theologians and the vivid, often more literal, interpretations found in popular belief. Learned scholars might debate the precise nature of hellfire. Was it a material fire that could affect spiritual beings, or a metaphorical representation of spiritual anguish? They might ponder the exact philosophical underpinnings of eternal punishment. Theologians like Augustine or Aquinas explored these questions with great intellectual rigor, sometimes allowing for more abstract understandings of suffering, such as the pain of loss, poena damni being the primary torment. However, for the largely illiterate populace, whose understanding was primarily shaped by sermons, religious art, and vernacular tales, hell was often envisioned in its most tangible, physical, and graphically detailed forms. The visceral imagery of popular visions, the dramatic enactments in morality plays, and the terrifying frescoes on church walls tended to emphasize the direct sensory experience of torment. This vernacular hell was immediate, terrifying, and left little room for abstract interpretation. Its fires burned, its demons tore, and its stenches choked. The very sources from which we draw our understanding of medieval hell also reflect a certain variability. Visionary literature, by its nature, often presented highly personal and sometimes idiosyncratic details, as individual seers recounted their unique journeys through the afterlife. While common motifs abounded, each vision could introduce new landscapes, new demons, or new torments, adding to the collective, ever-expanding lore of hell. Similarly, sermons would be tailored to specific audiences and occasions. A preacher addressing a congregation in a prosperous trading town might emphasize the dangers of avarice and worldly attachment, describing the specific infernal consequences for such sins. Another, speaking to soldiers before a battle, might focus on sins of wrath or the importance of a good death. The emphasis and selection of hellish imagery could thus be strategically adapted. Artistic representations, too, were subject to the constraints and opportunities of their medium, the preferences of patrons, the skills of the artists, and prevailing local artistic conventions, all contributing to a rich diversity within the overarching theme. Yet, despite these chronological evolutions, regional shadings, and differences in emphasis between learned theology and popular piety, it is crucial to reiterate the powerful unifying core of belief that transcended these variations. Across the length and breadth of medieval Christendom, hell was overwhelmingly understood as a real, physical place of eternal punishment. The suffering it entailed was conceived as both intensely physical, fire-ice mutilation, sensory assault, and profoundly spiritual, characterized by utter separation from God, despair, and unending remorse. This terrible destination was inextricably linked to the concept of unrepented mortal sin. The conviction that one's choices and actions in this earthly life had direct and everlasting consequences for the soul was a fundamental tenet, and the infernal realm was universally populated by Satan, the archfiend and deceiver, along with his legions of demons, whose primary function was to torment the damned and to tempt the living. The purpose of hell in this shared understanding was to serve as a stark deterrent against evil and as an ultimate, if terrifying, expression of divine justice. These core convictions provided a common framework of fear and belief that shaped the medieval worldview profoundly, even as the specific colors and contours of that fear might shift and shimmer across time and space. And so, our journey through the medieval understanding of hell, with its vivid landscapes of fire and ice, its myriad demons, and its meticulously imagined torments, gently comes to a close. We have seen how these powerful beliefs, drawn from sacred texts, theological interpretations, and the vibrant popular imagination, shaped art, culture, and the very fabric of daily life, casting a long shadow of fear but also reinforcing a profound moral order. As these historical echoes of deep-seated anxieties fade into the quiet of your room, may they serve only to highlight the peace and comfort that now surrounds you. The fervent fears of a distant past are but stories now, as you prepare for a serene and untroubled sleep. We wish you a very peaceful night and tranquil dreams.